Theme 3, Session 6. Let's say you own a farm. Your farmhouse and barn were built by your great-grandfather, but it is now going to be demolished without your permission in order to build a railroad right through the barn and the house. You call this bad. The people demolishing your house without your permission call it good. They might even say, as the bulldozer smashes through your house, this is the interest of progress. All right, we have a problem here, ladies and gentlemen. If everyone's concept of good is relative and frequently in conflict, then how can we effectively deal with the conflict? How can we resolve the conflict and many others? How can we resolve disputes over what is good without violence, which is probably the most important thing in the world today? If you cannot do that, the species will perish. That's why we have to learn how to do it. The solution to this problem has got something to do with development of seemingly impossible concept called absolute morality. And to prepare the way for this solution, I will give you a new definition. I will give you a definition of coercion. Coercion is any attempted and intentional interference with property. Now, this definition of coercion I've given you is not a relative definition of coercion, but rather it's an absolute definition. Whenever you have any volitional being interfering with the property of another, when it's intentional interference with property, you have coercion. It doesn't matter whether the person doing this coercion is of one age or another, one sex or another, whether they went to school, whether they flunked kindergarten, whether they're intelligent, unintelligent, live in this culture, live at that time. It's totally irrelevant. It's still coercion. Now I'll give you a very important definition that will enable us ultimately to bridge this gap between the physical sciences and the so-called social sciences. It's a definition of absolute good. Anything is an absolute good that is a relative good to at least one person, but does not involve the exercise of coercion upon another. One more time. Anything is an absolute good that is a relative good to at least one person, but doesn't involve the exercise of coercion upon another. Well, another way of stating that an absolute good is simply non-coercive action that the individual prefers. Or you could call that an absolute good action if you want. Now let's see if we can test certain actions to determine if those actions are absolute good or only relatively good. Let's say a man is loafing on the beach, all right, watching the sunset. Is that an absolute good or a relative good? Well, it's good. However, we don't quite, know the situation. We don't have enough information yet. What is the critical question that must be answered in order to determine if his actions of floating on the beach, watching a sunset, is absolute good or relatively good? What must we know? Whose beach it is? It's a critical question. Is it a critical question in your opinion? Because if this fellow, maybe he just climbed right over the fence, right over the no trespassing zone, he's on your beach without your permission. Trespassing involves coercion. And so his actions are relatively good for him, but not absolutely good by definition. On the other hand, if it's his beach, fine. If it's your beach and he is there with your permission, fine. It can be an absolute good. How about another situation? Let's say somebody is shooting pool. Is that an absolute good or relative good? We don't have enough information. What question must we ask? Whose pool table is it? Does it make a difference? Indeed. Because if he's just smashed his way into the pool hall using the pool table without the permission of the owner, that's probably relative good, but not an absolute good. If he stole the pool table, that's not absolute good. But it is his pool table. Or he goes into the pool hall, pays whatever they charge for the usage to hit balls with sticks and so forth. How about stealing hubcaps? That's relative good, right? But it could not be an absolute good because that involves coercion. I will give you a critical question that we call the universal can opener. And it asks this critical question, namely, whose property is it? In order to determine whether the action is absolutely good or relatively good, all you have to determine whose property it is and is the action being taken with the owner's permission or not. And there is actually two possible answers. One is yes and another is, guess what? No. And that covers all possible answers. Even if a friend of a friend told you that you can do it, but they are not the owner of the property, still not absolute good. I like to point out that a subjective good is simply a relative good that does not involve coercion. It doesn't mean that you have to call it good. For example, you don't have to enjoy the music of Vivaldi simply because I do. And this form of music will never likely be popular. You don't see something by Vivaldi on the jukebox or whatever it is. Absolute good is not the same as universal good. If everybody likes the music of Vivaldi, that it's a universal good, but that's not likely. And that's involved is the individual thinks is good, and then the good does not involve coercion. It becomes an absolute good. Is it simple as that? Simple as that. Another question, what is a moral action versus an immoral action? Is there any agreement on the subject? Do philosophers agree on this? No. Do theologians agree on this? No. There is virtually no agreement on what constitutes a moral versus an immoral action. Are you aware of this? Virtually no agreement at all. How we can coexist if we cannot agree on what is moral and what is not? I will give you now the definition of absolute morality. A seemingly impossible concept to devise or derive on any rational scientific basis. Nevertheless, here it is. Morality, or you can call it absolute morality, is the totality of absolute good. I know it's difficult to understand. Let me try to go into a little bit deeper understanding. Morality deals with the totality of volitional actions. A moral action is simply any volitional action that does not involve coercion, as simply as that. This is an absolute standard of morality. It's a simple concept. It's a simple concept. Either a man's volitional action attack the property of another or they do not. Attack or not, property of others. Either Smith stole an automobile or he didn't. Either he robbed a bank or he didn't. Either he trespassed or he didn't. The same goes not only for Smith, then for Brown too, and for Weinstein. So either a man's action coercively interfere with the property of another or they do not. No gray areas, no twice thinking, no looking into that deeper. Absolute morality, as defined, is a black and white concept. A common objection to this concept is, well, clearly you're oversimplified. I'll deal with that soon, the subject of oversimplification. There is a major, giant, horrendous philosophical blunder connected to this cliché. You have oversimplified. Person has nothing to do, no idea to say, no idea what's going on. His mind is not working, and you're oversimplified. The whole concept is alien to science. Simplification is the idea of science. Now that we have an absolute standard of morality that is moral, which is absolutely good, you can test any volitional action of any individual, anywhere, at any time, and determine whether the action is one, moral, two, immoral, or immoral is defined as not moral. Yeah. And now that I've introduced you to the concept of absolute morality, or just morality, I've laid the foundation for an even more lofty concept than morality, and that is absolute rightness. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that we will be able to decide what is absolutely right? Let's look at that concept. I've already said that absolute right in physics means that which is true and valid, or all the premises are true and the thought process is valid. Since that is such a useful concept, we'll retain it. Here is what absolute rightness looks like for the third science, volition. We retain truth, plus we retain validity, plus we add to that concept of absolute good. So what is absolute good? Which is both rational, true and valid, and moral. Absolutely right for the third science. Volition is simple, which is both rational and moral. What can be simpler than that? But simple, not necessarily easy to understand. The simplest things are usually, we talked about that, the most difficult to understand. It wasn't easy, I know, and not as easy as many things we've been talking about earlier. And I strongly advise to watch at least one more time. Or even maybe watch one more time and then third time, stop, rewind, watch most difficult parts again and again. To understand what we discussed is the basis, to understand what we discussed today is the basis of understanding, or for understanding of the rest of the course. Until next time.